Diese Konferenz wird nun aufgezeichnet.
And I would like to ask the colleagues to get off to turn off the video cameras. So use okay, and then there's one last remaining. I guess is not there. Maybe Mr. Steffens, so he can turn off his camera too. So maybe Catherine, you could send him in chat email. Okay,
yes.
And the others who come. Okay, so it's kind of improvisation, this conversation, and so welcome to you, Howie, again, and I hope you had already a cup of coffee, so you can go on for more coffee. So because it's early in San Francisco and it's 8 a.m. and you just got up, I guess. So yeah.
But you know the weather is good. You probably all saw that picture, which I think is famous, of the orange dawn here.
Yes, yeah.
The whole harbor was filled with this eerie orange color.
Yeah.
We woke up and that's what we saw. It was very frightening.
Yeah.
But now it's normal.
Now it's gone. Okay, so we just.
Now it's just plain San Francisco fog.
Okay, yeah. So we just played a piece of music which you registered in Grenoble in 2003 with your colleague Benoît Concoin. So just to get the introduction to this session, which is, you remember that, yeah?
That was a wonderful Alain Pessin, the French sociologist who unfortunately died quite young, insisted that I play the piano as well. Well, it's true, I played the piano professionally for a long time, but I had stopped doing that.
Yeah.
Mainly because the business that I participated in had disappeared. Because all the jobs were in taverns where they had entertainment. And as soon as television became widespread, all the taverns fired the musicians and bought a television set and put it behind the bar. And that was the end of my branch of the music business.
Yeah. You
this
wrote
is
a bit.
Social change.
Yeah. You wrote about. Pardon?
Dan invited me to Grenoble for a week to give talks and seminars and so forth. And he wanted me to play. So I said, well, I never play solo. I play always with a bass player for accompaniment. Well, he said, we have the jazz festival here every year. So I'll find out a good bass player. And he did. And Benoît was a wonderful, he is a wonderful bass player. And we were the living proof of what I wrote about in the book called Do You Know?
No.
How musicians who never met, have no time to rehearse, etc., can nevertheless give a good performance. Because there's so much in common and they're so accustomed to inventing the cooperation on the spot. And Pessin wanted us to make a record of that, which I was delighted to do.
Yeah, which was part of the French book Paroles et Musique, which was published by Harmattan in 2003. Yeah. I got one copy of that. So we call this session Sociology and Jazz, and maybe it's kind of the shortest resume of your public life. I don't know. So you could expand and you could add photography because it's another major area of work you were in. But so we started talking about the jazz. You somewhere you told that you started playing at the age of 12, and then you played piano, and during your studies in sociology, starting in 48, I guess, if I remember correctly, so you played sometimes for 42 hours a week in order to make some earnings at the time, not knowing yet if you would go for sociology or for music or so. So maybe a point of entry could be this relation between your musical life and your sociological life, if there is one. I don't know how you see that.
The music supported the schooling between a fellowship from the University of Chicago, so I didn't have to pay tuition, and paid my living expenses. And I found it actually, easy to do. And lots of musicians have what they call day jobs. You have your day job, and then you have your night job. So my day job was being a sociologist. And I did what seemed to me the sensible thing to do, which was when it came time to write a master's thesis, I was already doing what I had learned from Everett Hughes, was called field work, that I wrote down everything I saw and heard when I was being a musician, and had quite a body of field notes to analyze, and was able to write the master's thesis that way. And lived comfortably. It was very funny because at one point, this will interest everybody, I think, because Irving Goffman and I were students at the same time. And Irving and I got our PhDs the same year. And neither of us was able to find a job teaching, which is what we were supposed to do. And Irving went to Ernest Burgess, the head of the department, and asked him if he could find him a job as a night watchman or something at the university, which was his way of embarrassing poor Professor Burgess. At the last minute, I was offered a position at the University of North Dakota. Most people have no idea where North Dakota is, but it's way up at the top of the map. And it's not very many people live there. And for an urban kid like me to spend any amount of time in a place like Bismarck, North Dakota, was like being condemned to prison. So when I was offered the job, I said no, because among other things, it paid $4,000 a year. I made $80 a week playing the piano, which was exactly $4,000 a year. And I wouldn't have to live in North Dakota. So that seemed to me, I didn't have to think about that choice very long. And I figured that settled it. I was going to be a musician. But then Everett Hughes offered me a job doing research with him on school teachers. And that's how I ended up being a sociologist and a musician.
I have some problems with my email with my internet connection, so I will try to find a better place in my apartment soon, because it seems that I don't move. So yeah, thank you. So you wrote on musicians early in your career and then late in your career. And do you know the book you just referred to? Do you know about the repertoire and the way musicians can play together? And I don't know, being a sociologist, was this something which maybe sometimes intervened in the way you performed music? You were talking about playing the beer barrel polka and songs like that in weddings and other events in Chicago at the time. And I don't know how you see that. Was it a more kind of relaxing to play, or was it just a job, or did it interfere, or did sociology sometimes, I don't know, disturb the way you perform?
There is no interference. In fact, you'd be surprised probably, but I imagine it's still true that a lot of people have a second career as what we call a jobbing musician. You play a night here and a night there, a dance for these people, a wedding party for those people, so on. So it wasn't unusual for if you went to a party, if you went to, let's say, a wedding reception, and there was a band, it's almost 100% sure that the people playing in that band have a job in the daytime, which if you asked them what their profession was, they would say lawyer or salesman or whatever. But they also were doing this. Like Robert Faulkner, the trumpet player that I wrote Do You Know with, has been a professor at the University of Massachusetts for most of his life. He's retired now. And the people he played with were all people there in Amherst, Massachusetts, who had other jobs during the daytime, which probably would be regarded as their main profession or occupation.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a very common phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. I have some technical problems here.
Oh, you were supposed to practice.
I will go to change my the more better vision. Okay, so So can you hear me again?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. So hopefully my you wrote many books early in your career, and then you added a lot of books later in your career. So recently the books I would just like to mention: The Tricks of the Trade from '98, then Do You Know from 2009, Parole et Musique 2003, Telling About Society 2007, Thinking Together, about how you did the jazz book in 2013, and What About Mozart, What About Murder, Reasoning from Case in 2014, the Evidence book from 2017, and Exercises, a recent kind of book with Franco Leibovici, 2019. So it seems that in your book on evidence, for example, you're discussing some errors or changes you made in your thinking between. So there have been some errors in the moral entrepreneur category in the early book. So you're referring to some errors in the do you know in the repertoire book. So I would like to pick that up in order to ask you how do you see some changes in your perspective in sociology for the since or during the long years of your career, and what would be the major ones?
Well, it would be a miracle if I didn't learn anything in all those years. You're reminding me, Rainer, of some years ago, I spent 6 weeks in England, in Birmingham, as the Lord Simon Professor of Sociology. And at the end of the 6 weeks, I made a sort of brief tour of Britain. For like 5 or 6 days, I went from one university to the next.
Yeah.
In every place, I gave a talk. And then everybody, you know how British academics are, they're very competitive. And so everywhere I went, as soon as it was possible to ask questions, the first time it happened, I was surprised, but it happened at every stop, every one of the 5 or 6 places I spoke. But some young gentleman would raise his hand and say in a very ominous tone, "Professor Becker." I thought, oh, now what? And in 1983, you said, and then he would read something that I had written. He said, and this afternoon you said blah, blah, blah. It seems to be a contradiction. How can you explain that? And he was challenging me, apparently his thought was that once you said something, you had to defend it for the rest of your life. And I said, well, I guess probably I learned something in the interim. And there was dead silence because no one could understand what I was saying. Your idea of the way to do sociology was you established your theory and then you defended it against all criticisms for the rest of your life. Well, I never thought that way. I was taught by a really great sociologist and a great teacher, Everett Hughes. And Everett was a very interesting teacher. He never gave a coherent lecture. He went from one topic to another, a sort of stream of consciousness. Or if somebody asked him a question, he'd go off on that road. And it was amazing the number of things he knew about. Because what he really was a great comparative sociologist. So when he wrote his book about French Canada and the English and the French and the relations between those two ethnic groups in Canada, he had a background he had read about every situation in the world that anyone had written about where ethnic groups met and mingled and had to come to some kind of working arrangement between them. And so if you interrupted him as one student did once. He had just said some very general thing about relations between ethnic groups. And somebody posed a question about someplace that this man had just been, which was not the way Hughes had described it. And he said that to Hughes with some fear that, the professor would be angry. Instead, Everett said, "Oh, that's very interesting. Now tell me more about that." And then he created a new theory to cover that case. That was the model that I always had in mind, so that you learn from. The point of research is not to prove you're right, but to find out how the world is put together and then make sense out of that.
In your writings, you're referring to lots of sociologists, so it's not just Chicago School, the so-called, or whatever that means, but you consider yourself to be somehow close to, or to make use of Georg Simmel's sociology somehow, so behind Hughes and Parks, to go back to Simmel, but to Bruno Latour, you make very often reference to Bruno Latour. So how are there other sociologies who are part of this experience of changing or of getting new questions, or what does it mean for you?
Oh yeah, it happens all the time, Rainer. Everything I read, I try to incorporate. See, how can I use that? Americans are famous for pragmatism, which means, as far as I'm concerned, it's not a profound philosophical commitment. It's just a matter of doing the best you can with the materials you have available. And my hero behind Hughes is his teacher, Robert Park. Robert Park, I don't think he's very well known anymore, which is a scandal, because he was a truly great urban sociologist and trained generations of wonderful researchers and thinkers at Chicago. And just, I admired him very, very much. He left the University of Chicago just as I entered. He retired, and in those days, when you reached the age of 65, retirement was mandatory. You had to leave. And Park went to the all-black university called Fisk, which was in Nashville, Tennessee, and taught there for many more years. But he left the year that I became a first-year graduate student, so I never got to even see him. So as far as there is something called the Chicago School, which I think is kind of a myth. Park was it.
Okay, yeah. But I guess you nevertheless you did some classes on the Chicago School. You taught that, or am I wrong on that? So some courses at university, it's kind of common convention to refer to that. So what I would like to maybe to enter, because there could be many subjects to discuss. But so your recent work is very much kind of intervention into the practice of sociology. I would read it like that. So telling about society recommends to look for other genres to tell about society. Evidence is about the way we argue and we present reasoning and causes. And so I would like to ask you about if you have some kind of preferred methodology to do research. You practice ethnography, interviewing. How do you relate these? So it depends on the question, I guess. Or how would you see it?
Well, it depends on the situation. See, I've written a couple of pieces denouncing the idea of the Chicago school, because there was never a Chicago school. Louis Wirth, who was one of the professors there, said at the time that I was a student, he said, people talk about the Chicago school. He said, but I can't think of one idea that my colleagues and I in this department agree on. Because people forget that Chicago wasn't just Everett Hughes and Louis Wirth. It was William Ogburn, who was one of the founders of statistical, quantitative sociology, a very great sociologist. And I remember once, after I finished my PhD, for a couple of years, I stayed in Chicago, and they needed somebody to teach a class in the undergraduate school. They hired me, and then Hughes went to Germany for a year on a sabbatical leave, and I took his place and taught field work. And so I used to go to the faculty meetings, which I had never done before. And to my surprise, Ogburn and Hughes were very friendly with each other. And the students all thought that they must be enemies because Hughes was fieldwork and Ogburn was census, quantitative. And I said, Everett, it surprises me that you and Mr. Ogburn are so friendly. He looked at me, looked like I'd lost my mind. I said, what's wrong with you? He said, Will Ogburn and I are the best of friends. We've always been, which was a lesson to me. He didn't think there was a conflict. And if he did, we should know. So there's a lot of mythology about these schools of thought. And I think the reason it ever came up was that for many, many years, in the 1920s and 30s, there really essentially only was one important department, and that was Chicago. And almost all the PhDs that were trained at Chicago. And I have a vivid memory of sitting in Ernest Burgess's office, and I think he was trying to persuade me to take a job somewhere. And then the phone rang, and he excused himself, and he picked up the telephone, and he said, good morning, Forrest. Well, I knew he must be talking to one of his former students, Forrest LaViolette, who was the head of a department in New Orleans, in Louisiana. And he said, oh, yes, Forrest, I think I can find just the young man you're looking for. I'm glad that you called me, and we'll find somebody. And that's the way jobs were being distributed. This is a long time ago. So Forrest LaViolette, who was a student of Robert Park, would call Chicago and ask his teacher to send him a teacher for his department. So very far away from the elaborate hiring procedures to ensure fair play that we have now.
So you practice different methodologies, and you had kind of very different subject areas, or maybe so in education, professional education, and in the art businesses, etc. And you wrote about the arguments you had for making sociology relevant to society. I don't know, it was kind of a conference in Spain some times ago. So I don't know how you see today there's been the ASA meeting in San Francisco, or the online version of this meeting, because it didn't happen in a local situation. So how would you conceive of the relevance of sociology today? It's a big question, too big question.
Well, I think it's a misleading question.
Yeah.
Because, if I were to say, what is the relevance of chemistry to society today, it would be about the same thing. Relevance to what? My feeling is that people have gotten obsessed with the idea that the findings from their research must contribute to the solution of contemporary social issues. If we have a problem of race relations or of class differences, what can sociology contribute to make these problems less? Well, I don't think, my experience is that I could often tell people what the solution to their problem would be, but they would not be able to implement that solution. That is, if you wanted to improve race relations in the United States, there's some very obvious things you could do, but nobody knows how to make those things happen because they don't have, sociologists have no access to the means of exercising that kind of power. And they don't do research on how to get that kind of power, or they do and they don't find the answer. So it's an observational science, but it doesn't necessarily produce workable results, doesn't produce machinery to accomplish some given end. Mm-hmm. And so every thesis that I see these days, which I don't see a lot of anymore, every thesis has a lengthy final chapter explaining how this or that problem can be solved. And then they suggest means which are not available. Get the Congress to pass this kind of law. Get the international bodies to do this. Well, we don't know how to get them to do that. So the idea of doing research that will be immediately applicable, sort of like applied chemistry, is nonsense. Not going to happen. I don't think it's pessimistic, by the way.
Why not?
Well, because I don't think that was ever a viable goal. If that's what we wanted to do, we would be doing quite different kinds of research.
Yeah. There's been, or there's some discussion about, are we allowed to do research and do we exploit the people we are searching upon? They give us interviews, but we don't give anything back, or so, I don't know. Or if we get too much engaged for the field, I think this was a criticism addressed to Alice Goffman's work in the end, that she was too close to the field. How do you see this kind of phenomena? I don't know.
Well, I don't understand the criticism. I don't know what it means to get too close. Does it mean you don't look at certain things?
It means that you might be engaged too much in the practical issues and emotional issues of the field, and then maybe you will not be able to come back out and to have an analysis of it. So to being too close and not to, so the going native argument maybe. I don't know if it's important. I learned about that discussion in the US.
Well, I don't think it is important, because I think it's it's silly. I mean, the Goffman case, the biggest complaint that people made about Alice Goffman's research was very, very strange to me. It was that she wasn't fair to the police. She was running around with these young people engaged in criminal activities. When the police came, they ran and she ran. And there was some lawyer in Chicago who took offense at this, at the idea that people would be afraid of the police. Well, it's a common observation. Everybody knows, everybody can see, everybody can prove for themselves that police are not exactly what they claim to be. I mean, that was one of the things I learned as a musician. I worked in a bar. Once a week, I would see a police captain come into the bar and have a conversation with the owner of the bar, who also took bets on horse races in the daytime in the bar and broke all kinds of laws running the bar at night. And I could see the tavern owner giving the policeman a $50 bill. Well, that's all I needed to see. I mean, I was a Chicago kid. I knew what they were doing. He was paying the police to allow him to break the law. That was so well known in Chicago that it didn't cause any particular interest. Everybody knew that. And suddenly this was defined as being biased against police. So, you know, I don't even know what to say to critics.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I see what you mean. I would maybe like to ask. So you were once joking about that. I don't know. Who's responsible? Are you responsible for the legalization of marijuana usage in the U.S.? So you referred to your early work on how to become a marijuana user, and so do you know what's your role in that, or the more general interest is sociology somehow intervenes in what happens in society by just producing a study?
Well, I had. It's a strange story, but I did this research. At the time I did it and published those pieces, nobody thought it was interesting. When I first read a paper on that subject, there were, I think, 11 people in the audience. I counted them, including 2 nuns. I had no idea what they were doing there. And several people asked me, why did you bother to study marijuana? I said, what do you mean? It's an interesting question. They said, well, there's no money to do research on that. And that constituted what made it interesting. It's for them, that you would be able to get a research grant. I thought it was interesting because, in fact, it connected to an area of research in psychology where people were studying the effects of drugs. There was a formula that the effect of the drug depended on set and setting. Set meaning what you expected to happen, and the setting is where you took the drug and what influences were there. And so I was part of that kind of research. It was not a strange idea. But nobody pursued that. And then 15 or 20 years later, it finally became a hot topic, and there was research money available. And by that time, you see, I was a senior member of this very small group of people who had actually been interested in these things. So most of the people who studied drugs were pharmacologists and psychologists and people like that, chemists, biochemists. And they began to have meetings of people who were interested in the effects of drugs, and especially of marijuana. So, and everybody who went to those meetings pretty much was a biological scientist of some kind or a chemist. And they always felt they should have at least a token social scientist. And I was the only one around who had credentials. You know, I had actually published on this topic. So they would invite me, and I'd be there, and I got to see some very important events. The new edition of Outsiders has a chapter called Why I Should Not Get Any Credit for the Legalization of Marijuana. And I saw why marijuana was legalized when I attended these meetings, because the young biochemists, etc., one of them told me, said, actually, marijuana is a really interesting drug because it has quite a lot of psychological effect, but there is nothing physical that we can measure. It doesn't change. You know, when they study a drug, there's a standard routine they do. They check all the standard, you know, like blood pressure, heart rate, et cetera, et cetera. He said, and marijuana has all this psychological stuff going on, and there's nothing. Doesn't change any of the physical measures. So that's a real mystery. And we'd like to study that, but we can't do it because there's no money to do it, and they make a lot of trouble for you to get the drug to, you know, in a legal way to do research with and so on. And so finally, somebody in the government convened a meeting to discuss these questions. And there was a famous man who worked for the government chemistry thing about drugs in the United, you know, in Lexington, Kentucky. And Harris Isbell was his name. And he was identified with the position that marijuana was a harmful drug. So they had this meeting, and somebody from the government proposed to give a very large sum of money, to set aside a large sum for the study of marijuana. And he said, what in your opinion would be the most important thing to study? And he asked this guy, Harris Isbell. He said, Harris, you're the dean of research in this area. What would you say is the most important thing? And he said, well, without question, the most important problem is, what are the effects of long-term use of marijuana? And so the guy from the government said, and how would you propose we study that? And what he had done, he had what? I think for the government to distribute to researchers 10 milligrams of the active chemical principle in marijuana plant. So the question was, who was going to get how much of that to do research with. And so this important researcher said, well, yeah, the main thing is what is the effect of long-term use on various physiological and psychological measures. And so the government guy said, all right, how much would you need? So he said, well, let's see, began to calculate. You need to have 3 experimental animals, a rat, a dog, and a human being. And you need so much of the drug per kilo of body weight. And he went through all this. And it turned out he would need half of the amount the government had purchased just for his research. So all the others all of a sudden became interested, because if he did that, there was going to be that much less for everybody else to work with. And so the government guy said, I suppose there's good evidence that there are effects of long-term use. And he said, oh, yes. He said, well, would you, we were in Washington, D.C., where the National Institute of Health is. So they have a major library. And he said, well, give us some references, Harris, and we'll go look tonight, and we can discuss it tomorrow. So give us a couple of references. And then he began to fumble, because there was no research showing that there were those kinds of effects. And I knew he finally had to say, no, there isn't any literature, any scientific literature showing that. And I knew I was present at an historic moment. Because he knew that he could no longer testify, for instance, to a committee of the US Senate that it was a dangerous drug, because somebody at this meeting would say, but Dr. Isabel, didn't you say that there was no evidence? He knew that as well as I did. And right there was when the whole thing began to crumble. So that's the way change takes place.
I don't know about, so there's one of the questions in the audience about social media and how it affects social relations. And I don't know, in your books, it doesn't play an important role as far as I know. But
You mean like Facebook?
And all the kind of...
None of that was around when I was writing most of what I wrote.
And
but I think it's nowhere near as major a thing as, but I don't know. I mean, I haven't studied that.
But you just used for the making of Do You Know book, when you tell about how you did the email exchange, etc. So it's more practical usage, but it's not a study, for example.
That's just email. Well, that's not Facebook. That's just folks with me sending letters to each other.
But so as these media help to create this kind of echo chambers and how it's whatever it's called, so these kind of closed social worlds who can meet and so with high dynamic impacts, I guess, on society. In one of your latest or in the book on exercise, because we're coming close to the end, so you said, I quote, that social convention and scientific convention are major enemies of sociological thought. So you very much ask younger students and scholars to make things in a different way. Is that the right way to put it?
No, it's very simple, Ryder. The enemy of real knowledge is, you might put in quotation marks, what everybody knows. There's some things you don't have to study. Everybody knows that. Well, usually that's where when you find the things that everybody knows, that's what culture is. Culture is what you know and I know that you know, etc., so that we can talk as though that's settled. I mean, I'll give you a simple example. For me, it's always been a major way of finding out what's important in the situation I'm studying. Some years ago, my colleagues and I wrote a book called Making the Grade. Making the Grade was a study of the academic life of students in a university. So my colleagues and I, there were 3 of us, went to the University of Kansas and just walked, into the building they call the Student Union, with the cafeterias and coffee shops and so on. And there were 2 young women sitting talking with each other, and I told them who I was and what I was doing, and asked if I could join them, and they looked a little surprised, but said sure. So then they kept on talking, and one of them said to the other one, "Oh, you had a date with that guy that you thought was so cute last night. How did that go?" She said, "It was wonderful. It was really a lot of fun, and I'm never going out with him again." So I said, "Excuse me?" She said, "What?" I said, "Well, if it was so much fun, why aren't you going out with him again?" And she said, "Well, I found out that he has a very low grade point average. That's a commonly calculated number which puts together the numerical equivalence of the grades you've got, A, B, C.
C,
And makes a number, and a high, like 4.0 would be all A's. Perfect record. It goes down from there. And I said, well, so what? So he's got a low grade point average. And she was presenting this as what everybody knew. And she said, well, look, if he has a low grade point average, he may very well fail a couple of courses, and he won't be here next year. I don't want to get involved with someone who's not going to be here next year. I came to college to enjoy myself, and if I don't want to get mixed up with a guy who's going to be living in some other place 300 miles away, and we don't get to see each other. So better to stop it now. And the other young lady is sitting there nodding, saying, yes, yes, of course. Everybody knows that. That's culture. And that's,
and there's things in sociology too. Everybody knows maybe, so that your critique of convention somehow addressed against sociology too. So you don't want to see the next 100 studies on.
Let me give you an example. A friend of mine, I'm going to not mention his name, not to embarrass him, but I had sent him a draft of a paper I wrote, and he called me and he was quite concerned. He said, Howie, this is really an interesting paper, but you're supposed to have at the beginning of the paper, in part 1 of this paper, I do the following. In part 2, I do the following. In part 3, I do this. And I said, well, why would I do that? He said, because so people can look and see if there's which part of the paper will be interesting for them. I said, I don't want people to. by paper like a dictionary.
Yeah, yeah, yes,
I
yeah,
want them to be intrigued by a problem I pose and by the
yeah,
solution that I have.
yeah, yeah,
Like in the book Evidence, I start out explaining this very strange phenomenon of someone who was sure that there was evidence to show that something was related to class. I forget what it was. I think it was grade point average or something. And so he just thought he would check that out. He said, surely somebody's demonstrated that. There's nothing in the literature to show that. Everybody speaks as though it's been proven. It's so much what everybody knows that you don't need to check it.
Yeah, yeah,
Well,
I see.
To me, that's a red flag.
Yeah, yeah, okay, I can see.
You better check it.
Yeah,
I don't think anybody does yet. That's why I wrote the book Evidence.
Yes, yeah. If you allow, maybe we can have another few minutes, if you allow, because we are now, so 1 hour.
Up this early, I might as well.
So Miriam Sitter just sent me that she would like to ask you a question. I hopefully she can hear me and might just jump in with a question. It's a German colleague.
Yes, I can hear you, Rainer, and I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I don't turn on the camera for technical reasons. I guess it's better. Thank you very much, Mr. Becker. This is Miriam Sitter speaking here. I'm very happy to see and to hear you today because I appreciate you very much. And and I have a question, both as a sociologist and as a jazz singer as well. I saw and read a wonderful documentation and biography of Nina Simone a few days ago. And a wonderful woman and great musician who used jazz to raise awareness of the problems she was having in the society and in their times. And jazz was their political tool or their instrument to draw attention to the problems in society. And I'm interested in your opinion, Mr. Becker. What do you think? Has the role and the activity of jazz changed? Because from my point of view today, it has become more commercial, a more commercial role. But I guess great songs and big songs are only written if there are stories behind them, like stories of Nina Simone. And in my opinion, good music always tells a good story. And I'm interested in your opinion, if you agree with me, and what do you think if the role of activity and the activity of jazz music has changed in our times?
Well, I don't even have to think about that because the answer to any question like, has it changed, is yes.
Yes.
Everything has changed. Everything is always changing. So what's changed and in what direction and what's happened is, the work of years of research. I don't know. So I don't know what exactly went on in the recordings of Nina Simone that you're familiar with.
Yes.
I know, a very few instances where I knew the people who were involved in the recording, and I have some idea of what might have influenced it. But any question like that is a serious research project, not something that we can have an opinion about. You see what I mean? I mean, I don't know what I would find if I excavated everything that could be known about Nina Simone's life and career. Perhaps you do, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
You surely know more than I do.
Mm-hmm. Because perhaps if I might jump in, so because you started our talk today with the observation that the venues where you used to play, they have disappeared somehow in the bars, so they replaced it by TVs, and then there are still some jazz clubs, but there's this kind of evening listening commercialized jazz, which is played everywhere.
So much more than that. Today,
yeah.
Any young person who wants to can get a bachelor's degree in jazz. There's a whole school in Boston, the Berkeley School of Music, that gives degrees in jazz that are widely respected. The students who go through that school never play in a bar. They never play for a wedding or a bar mitzvah or a birthday party or whatever, because those things don't happen anymore. So it's completely different from anything that I experienced or that Rob Faulkner experienced. I mean, there's some overlap. There's still wedding parties, you know. And, the bride dances with her father, the first dance, and all that. But that's not enough to make a whole culture of jazz. Jazz is a different animal now.
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
And by the way, let me make a little lesson out of that. Anytime it's easy to formulate a question like that, you can be pretty sure that it's not the right question.
Okay.
Because a question like that, if you were serious, if you stop to be serious about what would be involved in finding an answer to that question, it would be a major undertaking. You know, it's not something that, oh, it's because of this. No, it doesn't work that way.
If there's another question from the chat which refers to the relation between theory and empirical work, and what's your idea of this relation? So it's a large question too, because it implies what means theory, what means empirical work, and so. And do you have a definition of what you would call a theory or theoretical work?
No, I try to avoid those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
I don't think they're very useful, because the real questions are about, I'm going to study this, right? Like we have this, God, I don't know what. Any ordinary everyday event, most of them we don't really know very much about unless we're involved in it. Like a lot of people are now discovering here in San Francisco that something that they took for granted, that they just assumed would always be there, which is going to a restaurant for a meal. Now they can't go to the restaurant for a meal. Now what? What do we do? All of a sudden, it's a great big problem. So it becomes a topic for discussion, but that's not a major theoretical problem, except if you see for its larger implications. What does going out to dinner consist of as a social event? Who's involved? Who's making money from it? Who's being trained to do those kinds of jobs? I mean, there's a whole world of activity behind a restaurant meal that ordinarily we ignore because it's not problematic.
Did you maybe, I would ask the last question. I don't know, in your long experience in doing empirical work in sociology, are there some experiences of, how could I call it, failed research or something where you thought, no, you cannot get through it. It's somehow it's too opaque, or you don't know the right questions to ask. So, because this might happen often to everyone. So it's, I don't know if you had that feeling, and what can we learn out of such situations if we somehow feel uncomfortable with the results or the research, I don't know, or the field.
Well, usually a well-done approach to research consists of finding out what's possible, what it's going to require in effort, time, what kinds of results you might find. I mean, it's very common to imagine a research project and then go to implement it and find out that half the things that you took for granted as constituting the problem don't exist. You know, it's not like that. So you have to rethink your problem. That's the most interesting part of research, is the part where you find out that everything you thought was wrong. You know, like when I found out that that young lady wasn't going to go out with this young man anymore because his grades weren't good, which is not, doesn't, on the surface, does not seem like common sense. Like, who cares? But she had excellent reasons. And the way the social life of that school was organized, it was very common in American universities. She was absolutely right, and I was ignorant. And that's my feeling about research. You go into something, you really are ignorant. You don't know anything about it. And the idea that you have to know all about it before you can start doing the research is wrong. By the time you finish the research, you know what the questions are.
Yeah. So if you come home then and you say, oh, it's much more complex than I thought of, then it might be not failed, but just
no, because now you have a start. It's just not what you imagined.
You
knew just the kind of answer you wanted. Well, that's not there. It was because the question was wrong.
Okay. So I would like to come to an end now. Maybe I should mention that there's been, you have a big fan in Hamburg, a German bus driver, female bus driver. I guess she wrote you a couple of years ago. She did touring with some jazz bands. I guess she's amongst the audience today, but I would like to pass her greetings, as well as greetings from Adele Clark, who asked me that. So, who told me to pass her greetings to you. I don't know if, I guess that Katrin Emmerich would like to have a final word for the session. I would like to thank you very, very much.
Thank her and for the company she represents for making my work available in Germany.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. I don't want to interrupt you. I could listen for another hour, but I think the most of our audience is going to the next session. So I think they have the meeting of the association. So I can only say thank you. Thank you so much for these special insights and into this special connection between sociology and jazz and in your life. So I guess we were all excited to hear these interesting stories and sites, and thanks for telling about society and about jazz, and we were all listening curiously, and we're happy to have you here. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rainer Keller, for making this possible, and I hope we can try this again in another conference maybe. So
Okay.
and thanks
Not
for
so
all
early
of
in
the
the morning.
audience.
Yeah.
So,
So have a nice day in San Francisco then,
yeah.
and maybe a longer breakfast now. And I'll come back via email to you soon. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you,
Well,
and I
soon.
Thank
apologize
you.
for my video videos. It just doesn't work anymore. Okay. Bye.
Like this. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye.